Hi there, Mallory from Humanitec here, and today we are going through using an internal developer platform as an application developer on a daily basis. What I'm going to show you is some of the developer experience that you might see when using an IDP with Humanitec at the center. So let's take a look at what we're actually going to see. So in front of you right now, you can see a reference architecture diagram. Today, we're going to be looking at an AWS setup. But what's important to realize is as a developer, it doesn't really matter what's running under the hood. As a developer, you are concerned with the developer control plane. So that's the front end of our platform. What you can see on this diagram is that we show a few things, including the Humanitec portal. I'm going to show you that, but what I'm also going to show you is interacting with GitHub and Score, as well as using Backstage as part of this overall demo. The other thing I want you to notice is that there are all sorts of things connected into this internal developer platform, but at the center, inside of that integration and delivery plane, right next to your CI and CD pipeline, is the Humanitec Platform Orchestrator. This is critical to the back end of your platform and will run all of the magic things that need to happen in order for you as a developer to get what you need. So like I said, we're going to focus in on the developer control plane today. Specifically, what I'm going to show you is how to interact with the platform in a few different ways. You're going to interact with it through Score, and you're going to interact with it through Backstage. But we're also going to look at the Humanitec UI, and I'm also going to show you some things inside of GitHub. Ideally, though, as a developer, this is the only part you need to be worried about. Even the platform source code doesn't necessarily have to fall into your day-to-day. The way we like to think about it is to separate out the application source code and platform source code into separate repositories. What this means is that it isn't a one-to-one relationship. One application doesn't need one set of platform configuration pieces. Instead, they are completely separated, so the platform source code can apply to many applications. So let's take a look. Score is one way you can interact with your platform. And what this is an open source abstraction for developer self-service. It's a single YAML file for a workload. And this is actually an open source project that we have that has been now part of the CNCF. You can check it out. You can contribute. It's definitely something exciting. In the context of what we're going to look at today, though, I want to show you a few things. So what you can see inside of this Score file is we're talking specifically about a service. So that is specific to this workload that we are looking at. And we're looking at some resources that we as developers need to have this workload do what we need it to do. So in this case, you can see we have a database of type Postgres, S3 buckets, and we have some DNS and HTTP routing. The great thing here is that it's a very simple request. At the end of the day, you know as a developer what you need. You don't necessarily need to worry about how or when you're getting it. Other than that, you need it now. So what does that actually mean? Inside Humanitec, your infrastructure and operations team are going to define some rules. Part of those rules isn't just what resources you can use, it's how those resources are actually defined and when and where you're allowed to use them. So what you can see here is a resource definition for Redis. In this particular circumstance, we are using Terraform under the hood to make this Redis happen. You can see a URL that points to a Git repository, and that repository contains the Terraform needed for Humanitec to do what it has to do with Redis type resources. On the bottom, you can also see criteria, and this is where your infrastructure and operations team will set up things like environment type, like environment specific names, like applications, where this resource type can be used. What this allows you to do is have a lot of different configurations or configuration possibilities, but only single interaction points for infrastructure and operations teams to keep things really simple. But what does this look like in practice? Inside of the platform orchestrator, you have a lot of business logic. So this is the infrastructure and operations side that I'm showing right now. You can see there's a bunch of different resource definitions for different types. So we have Postgres, DNS, workloads. There's actually 2 Postgres on here, and you can see that their context is a little bit different. I've got some staging and I've got a production level resource. On the other side, you can see that there's a resource definition particularly associated with that context and with that type of resource. As a developer, what you're going to do is make a very simple request. It's realistically an abstract request. You're just going to declare the dependencies you need for the deployment that you're currently working on. This is wired into your CI system, which is wired into the platform orchestrator, which is able to reference those resource definitions, like I mentioned earlier. What's important is the platform orchestrator also understands the context in which you are making a request. And that is going to allow it to create a resource graph for that particular deployment in the context that you're doing it. The resource graph is a really great way to see dependencies and to see how different pieces of a deployment are connected. I'll show you this in real life in a few minutes. So let's, for example, say we need a Redis cache. So all we're going to do inside of our score file is just add 2 lines, cache, and then type of Redis. We're going to commit that to our repository, and then our CI system will pick it up. It's going to let Humanitec know that we've done this, and Humanitec will also grab the context. Once it does that, it's going to go into the resource definitions and find the repository it's looking for, or find the resource definition it's looking for in order to make that deployment happen with what you've asked for specifically. Once it's done that, it does what it needs to do in order to generate the resource graph for this deployment. So you can see here that resource graph has highlighted the fact that we now have a Redis in place. The really cool thing is that it's using this definition for this environment. Now, realistically, any other application that meets this particular context and this particular set of rules can also use this definition. What this means for you as a developer is that when it comes to upgrading resources, making changes, or to new versions, your platform engineering team only needs to make a single change to apply to every single instance of that particular resource. It means you don't have to do it. It means you don't have to touch the Terraform, and you know that the resources you need are available when you need them. What does this also look like in terms of experience? Now, we talk a lot about golden paths, and the idea here is golden paths, not golden cages. The idea is that these paths exist for you as a developer, for your infrastructure and ops teams, as well as for your security teams, in order to drive automation and standardization. And these are the key things that make doing internal developer platforms so valuable. We'll look at a few examples here, and then I'm going to show you some of these in real life. So a very common golden path is just needing a resource. So for example, I need an S3 bucket for an existing workload. For a developer, generally in the old way of doing things, what this means is asking your operations team to spin this up for you, or logging into your AWS account, for example, to set this up. But now with an IDP with Humanitec at the center, all you have to do is add 2 lines of code. Operations doesn't need to do anything. It's already set up for them, and security can rest easy knowing that the standardization is there and that you can't go too far off path and create a potential vulnerability. Another example, you need to spin up a new environment. Let's say you want to create an ephemeral environment for testing. All you need to do is a git push, and all you need to do is use PRs to make that happen. And I'll show you this in a little bit. Operations and security don't have to do anything because their job is already done. They've set the parameters in place and talked about when and how this can be used. I mentioned earlier that case of upgrading a resource. So let's say you have Postgres and you want to move from version 14 to version 15 everywhere that resource is being used. As a developer, you don't have to worry about this. The job is on your operations team to update a single file to update that resource definition to make the change. They don't need to propagate it across every single application, across every single environment. It's just one change and one deployment. From the security perspective, this is also a very easy hands-off thing. They know that the standardization is in place with that file, that they don't need to go through and make sure that there won't be any vulnerabilities opened every time something is changed. Another example that is really commonly asked about is things like understanding diffs between 2 deployments or rolling back. As a developer, this should be easy for you. You shouldn't have to jump through hoops or wait for someone to get you fairly basic information. And in this case, you don't. You have the ability to have one-click interfacing with both of these things and be able to access it easily. When I say click, I also mean an API interaction. So anything you see inside of the Humanitec UI that can be actioned is also available as an API endpoint. We're an API-first product, just makes things much easier. So know when I say click, I also mean you can make an API call. And then another example here where no one really has to do anything is running policy checks and security signups. This is often deeply integrated into automated pipelines, and it just means that everyone knows that the right checks and balances are in place in order for a deployment to happen. What's really important here is that not everything has to be automated, but you absolutely can. We recommend automating as much as possible in order to give yourself the best level of standardization you can. So let's now look at a demo. I'm going to use Backstage for this because I think in this particular circumstance, it's a nice thing to be able to show. So let me go and say I need to create a new application. My team has made me 2 different templates that I can use to start from. So let's go with a Node.js service template, just as an example. So I'm going to hit choose. Inside of this, I'm going to give it a name, and let's call it something fun because I'm Canadian, and why not do something cool? We're going to call it Goose Moose. And why not make it silly? So I'll review this, just make sure everything is what I want it to be, looks good, and then I'm going to hit create. What's going to happen here is in the background, Humanitec is going to start orchestrating the creation of everything I need for this service to exist. So it's going to do a few things. It's going to make a base deployment, and it's also going to generate me a repository in the standard that my team has set out for me. So I can do a couple things here. The first thing I'll do is open the actual repository that's been generated. And this has been generated also with a score file that I can use to make changes inside of my workload. So you can see that we've got a nice standard here. The other thing it will do is set it up inside of Humanitec's UI. And what I can see is that Goose Moose now exists, and we have our development environment in place. If I go into it, I will also see that there is currently a deployment running based on the initial commit, so the initial spin up of this application and this repository. While it's deploying, let's jump back into Backstage. So I'll open it inside of the Backstage catalog now, and you can also see here the status of the deployment. We see that Goose Moose in the development environment is currently running a deployment in the development environment with the workload that would be currently deploying. So we'll let that do what it needs to do. And in the meantime, take a look inside of the Humanitec interface. Deployments sometimes take time. That is the nature of working with distributed systems. So we'll give it a few minutes. But what we can see inside of here is we see a lot of information. So we know when that pipeline was run, and we understand what that deployment is. We can clone it. We can look at the manifest, and we can also look at diffs. Now it's going to have a couple errors while it's still finishing its deployment here, so we'll give it a few seconds. If I needed to, I could also redeploy. Let's say you need to refresh something, or let's say that your DNS certificate expired, and part of how you fix that is a refresh or a redeployment. That is where you would do it here. So we'll give it a few seconds to finish up what it's doing. In the meantime, we'll take a look back here at Backstage. So we still see we have an issue here, which is fine, no problem. We'll let it figure itself out, but now we can at least see the resources that are in place. So we've got a database, we've got some DNS, and we've got a routing as well. What's important here to know is that I haven't had to go and ask anybody to create any of this stuff for me, which is fantastic. Back in Humanitec, we're now seeing that this deployment was successful. I can now click on the URL that has been generated for me, and here we are, a Hello World page for this service. So that is brilliant. We know that's been done. So how do I make a change? What do we do next? Let's do it inside of code with Score, and I'll show you. Now, normally what you would do is pull this into your IDE of choice and go ahead and make the change and commit it. I'm going to do it inside of GitHub, inside the file, maybe to make people panic, but actually just for simplicity. So if we look at the Score file here, we see we have what we need. So I've got my ports. I've got my target port of 3000 for this particular container. And then I also have the information I need for the database. There are variables in here that are injected as part of the deployment process. I don't need to go and grab their credentials. That is all done for me. Next, we see our resources. So we have our DNS, we have our route, and then we also have our MySQL database. But I want to add Redis here as well. So what we're going to do is add 2 lines, cache, and then we're going to go type Redis. So for me to get a Redis cache inside of my deployment, that is all I have to do. So we're going to commit changes. And what I want to show you is something really cool. And we're going to actually create a brand new branch here. So what I'm going to do is say adding Redis. And we're going to then change the branch. We're going to call it Goose on the Loose and create ourselves a pull request. So let's propose the changes now. So we see that we have this PR, it's in place, and it's ready to go. Now what I'm going to do is create the pull request and formalize it. So generally in most scenarios, that PR is going to have to be reviewed by a human before that ephemeral environment can be generated for testing. In this case, though, this will all be done for me. So what's happening now is GitHub Actions is running, talking to Humanitec and saying, hey, I need you to do a thing. So there's no conflicts. That's fantastic. Let's check out the details and see what's actually happening. So everything is starting in terms of building our container image. We're going to run some Docker push. And you can see that Humanitec is also going to be informed, and then the score file will run. If I go back and look inside of Humanitec, we will see that in a minute, it will pop up that another deployment will be running. Just give it a second because at the moment, it is still getting to that stage. If I refresh, should be able to see it coming. Still working. So what we'll do actually in the meantime is look at Backstage, and you can actually see what's happened is a new environment has been created and it is in progress in deploying. And if I go back into GooseMoose, I will also see in Humanitec that that environment has been spun up. That is also why I did not see any deployments in the development environment. So you'll see right now that adding Redis has been grabbed by Humanitec and that deployment is currently ongoing. So we'll give it a little bit for that to happen. In the meantime, I'm going to show you the resource graph. So we're now back in our main branch and we're looking at our initial commit. What we can see inside here is what is available to us and the dependencies of all of the resources that we've deployed. So I can highlight things. I can look at, for example, the workload, and I can see some information about that particular resource here. And then I can focus in and see what the dependencies for that element are. So in this case, we've got a route, we've got a MySQL database, and we've got external DNS. I can go back and then also look at other pieces. So this DNS has a lot of things that are dependent on it. We have the route, we have a workload, and we have an ingress module that is related to this particular resource. This is really powerful. You can understand how things interact with each other and how they connect in a visualized way. So one of the hardest things about building a platform is understanding dependencies and how they relate to each other. We've visualized this for you and made it much simpler to figure out. So now that we've taken a look at that, let's go back and look at our PR environment. So it looks like our deployment is completed. We can see that here inside of Humanitec, but we can also see it inside of Backstage. And I can also see inside of GitHub that it is completed. Inside Humanitec, we can now look at our resource graph and see some changes. So what I should be able to see now is that we have a Redis cache. And that Redis cache has been brought in as dependent purely on the workload. That is the only dependency link we have for that Redis cache here. You can do things differently, but that's just this particular example. So let's take a look. We've had a URL generated for us, and we now have this version in place. I've not made any changes on the front end of this app, so you can actually see that Redis, but that's fine. We know it's there in the back end. So let's say I'm done with my ephemeral tests, and I am ready to merge that into the main branch. All I'm going to do is go back to that pull request, and I'm going to hit merge. What will happen now is that all of the resources I created specific to this ephemeral environment will be deleted, and that ephemeral environment itself will also be deleted. So let's have this happen. So let's hit confirm. And what will happen now is GitHub Actions will trigger this inside of Humanitec. So if we go back to GooseMoose, we're going to give it a few minutes for that PR environment to be deleted. The great thing about this is that you are saving yourself money and you're saving yourself time. You don't have to go to someone to have them manually delete resources, and your finance team will be much happier because they're already gone. They've been used, they've been deleted, they aren't sitting around and running. So I'll give this a refresh and see if we're done. Looks like we're all completed. And if we go into Backstage, we'll also see that the PR environment is also done. And right now, the merge inside of the branch is being deployed into the main development environment. So we'll give it a second because it's still doing its thing. All right, and now we're done. So what we see now is that our development environment has that Redis cache linked to it, and we still have those level of dependencies. I still have that one-to-one with the workload. It is exactly what I wanted and exactly what I did inside the PR. I can check and see, yep, indeed, my front end still works. My application is running. And if we go into Backstage, we'll see the same thing. Inside of our Git repository, we are now fully merged, and we can look at the application itself and see that the merge was successful and that everything looks good. If I check the score file, indeed, there is my Redis. That's just a small example of what you can do. As a developer, I've shown you some common things that you're going to experience. So what we've looked at is deploying a sample scaffolded workload. We did this through Backstage. We've also added a variable. We've added an item into that score file and run it. What we did inside of that was also adding a Redis database. So there's a Redis database that we are now using, a Redis cache, in order to get things done that we need when we make a deployment. As part of that, we created an ephemeral environment through a pull request in order to test what we needed to test quickly and get it out of the way. We've also exposed the workload via a DNS, and that's been very simple inside of that score file without too much work. As most developers know, networking stuff is an absolute nightmare, and it really isn't that fun to learn. So we interacted with code, we interacted with score, and we also interacted with a portal. We looked at both Humanitec's portal as well as Backstage in order to do what we needed to get done. So you've seen a few things now, and I encourage you to ask questions and also talk to your platform team about what works for you as a developer. What's so important is making your experience better, and I encourage you to give the feedback to your platform team about what you really need out of a platform in a day-to-day basis. Make sure to ask us questions too if you'd like to see some more examples or you'd like to see some different use cases, and we would be happy to show them to you. Again, let us know if you have any questions, and we look forward to talking with you soon.